Lio Jelly started his colorful career in the Second World War. He was one of the few individuals who can conclusively be proven to have worked for the Gestapo and the communist underground simultaneously. He had the communist underground in Italy convinced that he was spying on the Gestapo for them and helping them in their underground activities, and he had the Gestapo convinced he was spying on the underground for them. And he carried it off so successfully that he didn't get shot by either side and was not put on trial as a war criminal afterwards. With a record like that, it was only natural that he would believe he had very good luck and that the world consisted mostly of idiots who he could manipulate easily. So in the 1950s, he went to work for the CIA. His first job for the CIA was to move the Italian labor movement in a right-wing direction. The CIA felt the Italian labor unions were getting too left-wing. So Lio Jelly hired Sophia Loren to make short television bits of propaganda for the right-wing unions and against the left-wing unions. He also bribed all the left-wing union leaders who would take bribes so that they would take a more right-wing position. And with left-wing union leaders who would not take bribes, he arranged for the mafia to kill them. And so Italy took a sharp turn to the right at that point, as students of modern history may remember. So the CIA was very pleased with Lio Jelly, and they put him in charge of a lot of other projects. For a while, he was working directly out of the American Embassy in Rome. It was around that point that he went to work for the KGB. Well, if you can work for the Gestapo and the communist underground at the same time, you obviously are capable of working for the CIA and the KGB at the same time. Jelly shortly thereafter joined the Grand Orient Lodge of Egyptian Freemasonry, which was founded by the Duc d'Orléans and Count Cagliostro in the 18th century. And it is not recognized as a true Masonic lodge by any American Freemasons that I've ever encountered. Nonetheless, it's the strongest Freemasonic lodge in Europe. American Freemasons don't want to admit that. They say, oh, it's only a few nuts in France. The Grand Orient Lodge is all over Europe, not just in France. 1782 or 3. I don't know exactly. 82, 83, somewhere in there. The Grand Orient Lodge played a significant role in the French Revolution and in the Paris Commune of the 1870s, and where all Scotch Rite lodges have the Bible on the worshipful master's table in the center of the lodge, the Grand Orient has a book of blank pages. You can interpret the symbolism for yourself. Within the Grand Orient Lodge of Egyptian Freemasonry in Italy, Lio Jelly formed a separate group called Pe Due, which means Propaganda 2, which was named after Propaganda Uno, a socialist group of the 19th century. Propaganda 2 had very little in common with Propaganda Uno. P2, to keep it simple, and I won't bother with the Italian names anymore, P2 eventually recruited 900 members of the Italian government. Some of them joined willingly because P2 had a lot to offer them, because it was gradually taking over the whole Italian government, and a large part of the Italian press and banking business too. Some did not join willingly, but one of the rules in P2 was that you had to write out a full confession of all your crimes to your immediate superior, who would then give you forgiveness for them. And by this method, Lio Jelly developed extensive dossiers on everybody in Italy in any position of power. You know, I quoted earlier from the Watergate tapes about Hunt and knowing the whole Bay of Pigs thing. Another poignant line in the Watergate tapes is when Nixon talks about Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, and he said, Hoover would have fought. He would have scared hell out of people. He has a file on everybody. the nostalgia in that. You have this feeling Nixon thinks, here I am, I'm president, and I don't have a file on everybody yet. But that son of a bitch Hoover does. When Tom Murphy was made Attorney General by Roosevelt, he told all of his friends, the first thing I do when I get to Washington is I'm going to fire J. Edgar Hoover.
What year was that?
1940. Are you taking notes? A year later, some of Murphy's friends caught him at a party and said, whatever happened to firing Hoover? And he said, nobody can fire J. Edgar Hoover. That son of a bitch has something on everybody in Washington. Well, Hoover lived out his whole long life. Nobody ever did fire him. He died in office. Nobody could fire him. He did have a file on everybody. Well, Lio Jelly set out to get a file on everybody in Italy. And by the time he was through, he had over 950 members of the Italian government in the P2 group. This included the chief of the secret police. So when the Italian government indicted Lio Jelly for plotting a fascist for managing a conspiracy with the intent of committing a coup d'etat and installing a fascist government in Italy, by the time the police got to Jelly's house, he had left for Uruguay, because the chief of the secret police was a member of the conspiracy and tipped him off. The chief of the secret police was indicted for conspiring with Jelly in several bombings which were blamed on left-wing terrorists when they were first committed, and in planning a fascist coup, and in the whole general conspiracy of laundering cocaine and heroin money. He died while awaiting trial. Jelly escaped to Uruguay. He came back a year later to Switzerland to get some money out of a numbered bank account and was put under arrest by the Swiss police since he was wanted in Italy, as I say, for financial frauds, stock and currency frauds, drug offenses, and plotting to overthrow the government. So the Swiss held him for the Italians to come pick him up. They held him exactly 3 days. The Swiss are alleged to have the most incorruptible police in Europe. Or they used to be alleged to have that until they tried to hold Jelly. They put him in their maximum security prison, and within 3 days he disappeared and was back in Uruguay. The Swiss are still investigating how that happened. The prison is in Geneva. I was there last year. A lot of tourists are now coming to see the prison. This case is much better known in Europe than in the States. There's been endless newspaper articles about P2 and the Vatican Bank. It's got less publicity over here for some reason. And I suggested, since the tourists are coming anyway, the prison might as well turn itself into a real tourist attraction. I said they should have over the gate of the prison the 3 monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, and in nice Gothic German script, ficken Sie nicht mit P2. Don't fuck around with P2. They've got lodges all over Latin America, Central America, and in the United States and Canada. Lio Jelly was a guest at Ronald Reagan's first inauguration. There's a photo of Jelly and Reagan at the inauguration in a private conference, and they're both laughing. I often wonder who they're laughing at. Anyway, Jelly set up the system through which the cocaine and heroin was being laundered through the Banco Ambrosiano of Calvi and the Cisalpine Bank of Calvi and Marcinkus, and the Franklin National Bank run by Michele Sindona, who was another member of P2, who had started out as a lawyer for the mafia and founded several banks of his own in Italy, and then came to the United States and started the Franklin National Bank, which eventually acquired a large interest in Paramount Pictures. And Sindona sold part of his interest in Paramount to the Vatican. So every time you go to see a Paramount movie, you're supporting the Pope. He also sold part of it to the Mafia, which is the most interesting sociological strange loop I know. The Godfather is a Paramount movie. Every time The Godfather is shown on television, the Mafia makes profits off it. Thanks to the ingenious Mr. Sindona. Michele Sindona was eventually indicted in New York for stock and currency fraud and embezzling $55 million from his own bank, the Franklin National Bank, and he disappeared. According to Nino Lobello, the Vatican correspondent for the Herald Tribune, he flew back to Rome and conferred with Archbishop Marcinkus. Wherever he was, he finally did return to New York and announced that he'd been kidnapped by the KGB, but had managed to escape. The jury did not believe him. He was convicted of 65 counts of stock and currency fraud and faking his own kidnapping to avoid standing trial. He then put up an extensive, heavily financed legal battle of 3 years to avoid being extradited back to Italy. He was eventually extradited back to Italy, where he was convicted of murdering a bank examiner. And then he was awaiting trial on the charges that he and Lio Jelly and Roberto Calvi and several others had been conspiring to overthrow the government and institute a fascist government, as well as various drug offenses. While he was waiting trial on those charges, Michele Sindona was poisoned in his cell. There were two different accounts that appeared in American newspapers within about 8 hours of each other. According to one account, Sindona got his evening meal and suddenly let out a laugh and said, "I will not spend my life in prison. I have just taken poison." According to another account, he just had his evening meal when he let out a scream and yelled, "The bastards have poisoned me!" That seems to depend on which jail guard you want to believe. Anyway, he didn't stand trial for trying to overthrow the government. A fellow named Nino Piccarelli was putting out a newspaper called the Osservatore Politico, and he was very interested in Jelly and Sindona and Calvi and the weird things that were going on in the Italian banking community. He did quite a dossier on them for one issue, and he sent a copy to the Pope at the time, Pope John Paul I. Pope John Paul I, who was succeeded, as you remember, by John Paul II, which I thought showed a lack of humor. If I was succeeding John Paul I, I would have called myself John Paul Ringo and get a real tradition going, but this crazy Polak who got in called himself John Paul II. Anyway, John Paul I read this stuff that Peccarelli sent him. He was so incensed, electrified, galvanized, and pissed off in general that he ordered Cardinal Vio to do an extensive investigation of the extent to which P2 was using the Vatican Bank for criminal purposes. The night that the Pope ordered that investigation, he was taken suddenly dead. There have been numerous claims that he was poisoned by the Council of Cardinals. These claims have not been substantiated in court. A good summary of all the evidence can be found in David Yallop's book, In God's Name. The Vatican has refused to release the death certificate, so we don't even know what the doctor said the Pope died of. We just know what the Vatican says the doctor said. They have not let any journalist see the death certificate, and they did not allow an autopsy. Nino Peccarelli, however, the guy who sent the Pope this inflammatory material about P2 and the Vatican Bank, we know what happened to Nino Peccarelli. He was shot dead on the streets of Rome. He was shot through the mouth. The mafia calls that sasso in bocca. That's the traditional mafia punishment for informers. Strangely enough, it happened to Sam Giancana, too. Do you remember Sam Giancana? He was the guy who delivered Chicago to Kennedy and got pissed off because Kennedy did not lay off the mafia after that. Giancana was shot through the mouth, too. So was George D. Morgenschild, who was a close friend of Lee Harvey Oswald in Fort Worth and Dallas, who was suspected of being a CIA agent by a lot of conspiracy buffs around the country and private conspiracy investigators. When the Morgenschild was subpoenaed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he was found dead, shot through the mouth, too. That was ruled suicide. I guess it's a coincidence.